character creation and the basic rules. If you've ever been interested in playing 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, you do need to be able to build yourself a character. So, how does one set about doing that? We have various options, and thankfully the step-by-step character creation from the basic rules is a wonderful way to learn. I shall also be walking through this using the D&D Beyond character creator, which I think is a lovely tool to use. So, first of all, probably going to come up with a character name. I find it very helpful to come up with a vague concept of the character you want to create before you start choosing things like your race and your class, your abilities, etc. In this case, we shall have Layman, the Q-Man. Seems like a very appropriate thing to do. So, if we have to start creating a character, we might want to consider either what class we're going to start with, or what race we're going to start with. In this case, we shall choose from the player's handbook, more specifically the basic rules, and we have the human. I'll get into what ability scores are in a small moment, but all we have to pay attention to is the fact that the racial traits of the human grant +1 to all ability scores, and an additional extra language. No surprises, an extra language just means that you can speak more than one. In this case, the human shall be able to speak Dwarvish. We could decide, perhaps, from a backstory perspective, that this character grew up among dwarves, or has some reason to speak Dwarvish. You can always ask your dungeon master if there is any particular reason your character may speak a language. Remember that coordinating your backstory with your DM can be rather helpful to help it sort of fit into the world and to avoid having to do any lengthy rewrites if your character does not fit the story. After that, I would actually suggest looking at the abilities. Abilities are fairly important for something called ability score and then skills. We'll get into skills a little bit later on, but I'm going to explain all 3 ways of generation methods. Now, as a bonus, I'm actually creating this character for a short campaign I'm going to be playing in as a 3rd level fighter. So I'm going to go really quite in depth with how fighters work, and I'm going to really touch upon the other mechanics of different classes. This is because if I was to go through every single class with a fine-tooth comb, I would probably be here for over 3 hours. So, let's first take a look at the standard array because it comes up first. When you assign a standard array, you get to choose between 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8 for your different ability scores. This then has an effect on your total modifier, which in turn impacts the dice rolls you may make. For instance, attacking with a great axe would impact you'd use your strength modifier to aid in making the attack roll hit. If we're playing a fighter, chances are we're probably going to want to have fairly decent strength. So we'll put strength as our highest score, which turns out to 16. For every 2 points over 10, a modifier goes up by 1. So since this is 16, which is of course 3 scores of 2 higher than 10, I have a modifier of +3 whenever I make an attack. This comes from the base score of 15, plus the racial bonus of +1 from playing a human. Next, dexterity. Dexterity impacts quite a few stats and is very powerful. If you're playing a fighter and you're not going for a strength-based fighter like I am, you're probably going to want to have this at 15. It impacts your armor class, which is how hard you are to hit, as well as things like sneaking and sleight of hand. In this case, we're going to have this at 14, simply because a high AC makes you harder to hit, which increases your sturdiness on the field. Because of the +1 modifier, it goes to 15, which has no real mechanical advantage over 14. You might be able to tell we're kind of going over this in order. Let's go with 13 for Constitution, which means I've got a modifier of +2. Constitution governs how much health you have. So as a 1st level fighter, I would have 10, which is the hit dice. We'll get into the different hit dices in a moment. +2, which would come up to a total of 12 total base HP. Intelligence isn't really a priority for a fighter. So, depending on whether you see them as being a dullard, or if you see them as being mildly intelligent, or at least average, you can have a score of 8, 10, or 12. In my case, I don't think my fighter's the brightest, so I'm going to give him a score of 8. What this means is we end up with a total score of 9 and a modifier of -1. This means that if I'm ever supposed to use intelligence for a check or a saving throw, it's going to be at a slight disadvantage because of that -1. Even a 20 will come out to be a 19. This leaves wisdom and charisma. Now, having a high wisdom is usually kind of useful because it lets you spot traps a little bit easier and general perception stuff. So I'm going to have the wisdom at 12, which turns out to be 13, again because of the racial modifier. And 10 charisma for a total of 11 on that score. Now, I'm going over the human because it gives a very basic +1 to everything, but we can also very quickly go over the different races in the basic rules and what kind of benefits they'll grant you for playing them. For instance, if we were to choose to play the Mountain Dwarf, we would get +2 to the Constitution. We would also gain Dark Vision, Dwarven Resilience, Dwarven Combat Training, and Stone Cunning. Now, humans are relatively boring in terms of additional racial abilities, but they make very good all-rounders. We'll also cover feats with the Variant Human by the end of this. Now, Dark Vision will come up. Almost all of the races in the player's handbook have Dark Vision, and so many more outside of it that you can pick up by, say, getting Volo's Guide to Monster or other sources also have Dark Vision. Accustomed to a life underground, you have superior vision in dark and dim conditions. You can see in dim light within 60 feet of you as if it were bright light, and in darkness as if it were dim light. Little bit of advice to any DMs out there. This does not mean that you have impeccable vision even in the depth of the dankest cave. What this means is you can see in the cave, but not very well. Being in dim light grants a -5 to all perception checks because you have disadvantage. It also means that you cannot discern colour, as stated here, so if an enemy was, say, grey on grey, they might be very hard to see. Dwarves gain Dwarven Resilience. They have advantage on saving throws against poison, and resistance against any poison damage. So things such as poison dart traps will have less of chances of actually dealing damage to you. Dwarven combat training means we have proficiency with these things. We'll get into proficiency almost near the end because it does tie in very much with character sheets. Tool proficiency, again we'll get into that. Stone Cunning. You were considered proficient in history and double your proficiency bonus for the check when you make checks based on stone. This probably won't come up very often. However, I will state that it does come up when you're talking about stonework. It's what we call a ribbon feature, which is kind of good for roleplay, not really interesting for anything else. It has no real mechanical benefits. I'll also very quickly go into the half-elf because it's one of my favorite options here. You get +2 to charisma and +1 to 2 other ability scores, meaning the half-elf is very good as a talkative face, whilst also having a variety in its mechanical skill set. We have Dark Vision, Fey Ancestry, and Skill Versatility to round out its abilities granted by its race. We've been over Dark Vision, so we don't need to look too much at that. Fey Ancestry. You have advantage on saving throws with being charmed, which means that anything that would charm you won't. This will come up pretty often, to be honest, so it's actually a rather useful thing to have, but this is also something your DM will tell you to roll. The DM, of course, decides all the implementation of the rules, despite, there being a handbook. So you might not ever be charmed, but it is pretty likely if you face spellcasters or illithids, or as we call them, mind flayers. Skill versatility grants proficiency in 2 skills of your choice. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. We will get into proficiency slightly later. I don't want to drag on this too long. Well, let's set ourselves back to a basic human. I like humans. They're pretty versatile. Now, we have our abilities all set out. There's a couple of things that we'd actually be pretty decent at doing besides playing a fighter. With a strength of 16, we can make a fairly decent barbarian. We have high enough dexterity and constitution to be able to run such a role. If we were to switch some of these around, we could play almost any class with a decent degree of competency. For instance, you may wish to end up playing something along the lines of, say, a paladin, in which case we might need to find some way of boosting our charisma. Perhaps we'd have to cut from the wisdom into the charisma, as paladins require both a good decent strength, dexterity, constitution, and charisma ability spread. But since we're going to be playing with a point buy system, in my case, we'll go over that too, as well as manual enrolled. Manual enrolled. Now, you roll a bunch of dice, and then you drop the lowest one. Oops. So, let's just roll some dice. We'll see what we get. How will this impact the character we are building? Rough. Oh, okay, we have a very decent spread here. You are then allowed to take the dice that you roll, in the case of rolling. We call this 4d6, drop the lowest. So, again, I'd probably want to have decent strength. High dexterity, but unfortunately, because all my other scores are low, it's rather difficult to say where I'd put, say, constitution. What's more, we're rather bad at two different ability scores, which means that, say, if we wanted to have a decent charisma, we'd end up with a spread something along the lines of this. We'd be pretty good at hitting things, and we'd be pretty hard to hit in return with 16 at dexterity. But we're not going to be the tankiest person around with low constitution, we're not the brightest, we're not the wisest, we are decently charismatic. If you were to play a paladin, you could probably get away with such an ability spread. Point buy. Point buy is generally regarded as fairly balanced in terms of character creation. Everyone has the exact same tools available to them, and you can specialize or not specialize to any degree you wish. Out of a pool of 27, you can allocate points. There's a table for this within the basic rules if you so choose to go through and look at that. Specifically, determining ability scores has this. Their section of ability scores chooses to use a standard array, but it's always nice to be able to look at things such as point buy. A score of 8 is the baseline and comes at a 0. A score of 15 is the highest you can get with point buy and it costs you 9. Out of 27, this means that you can have exactly 3 scores completely maxed. Unfortunately, you'll suffer for everything else. In my case, I think I'd like to have fairly decent dexterity and constitution, so I can kind of round out the other two stats to be a little bit more favorable. If we were talking strictly about min-maxing, which is of course getting the highest bang for your buck, because I get a +1 in every stat from playing a human, I could dump my dexterity and constitution to 13 because it will round up to 14 because of the +1 bonus from playing a human, and then dump those in the wisdom, charisma, and intelligence slots. Alternatively, I could decide that I'm okay having low dexterity, but maybe I want that little bit of a pump to charisma, so I might say, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice charisma to an 8 in order to get up to 15 constitution. This is kind of a very well-rounded character, and if we focus on strength-based weapons, we won't really suffer too much for such a choice. Classes. Ignoring the one at the very top, because that is exclusive to Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and/or the Eberron sourcebooks, we have Barbarians, Bards, Clerics, Druids, Fighters, Monks, Paladins, Rangers, Rogues, Sorcerers, Warlocks, and the Wizard. The Wizard is a rather interesting class, but we'll get to that eventually. We're going to work from the way top and make our way down. Now, Barbarians. Barbarians have what we call a hit dice of d12. What this means is that when we are calculating level 1 health points, the Barbarian will have 12 plus their Constitution modifier. The primary ability here is listed as Strength, but you also want to have decent Dexterity and Constitution to really help your frontline. They have something called saves. If a spell or a trap targets one of your saves, your DM will call for you to make a saving throw of that specific kind. Often for traps you will hear the phrase, make a dexterity saving throw. And for spells, it can be usually along the lines of intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, but obviously there are also saves for strength and constitution. So unless your character and you roll a character with perfect stats, you're always going to suffer in some area. However, because your barbarian in this case would be proficient in strength and constitution, you get to add what's called the proficiency bonus to your character. The proficiency bonus is listed alongside every single class table found in the basic rules. We'll look at the fighter here, because this is what I'm going to be focusing on the most. As you can see, the proficiency bonus is listed here in the table. It's the same for every single class, however, some characters, the rogue exclusively can double their proficiency bonus, and the bard gets to add half the proficiency bonus to anything they are not, quote, proficient in. The proficiency bonus increases slowly as you level up. At 5th, 9th, 13th, 17th level. I'll get into what that means when we're rolling the characters. So I'll show the character sheet at the very end. Barbarians here specifically have the action of raging, which means that they can take half damage. You have advantage on any strength checks and strength saving throws. Now, we'll get into advantage and disadvantage here because it makes good sense to describe them as the terms come up. Advantage is the act of rolling a second 20-sided die when you're called on to make a check. In this case, if you have advantage, you get to roll 2 and then take the highest number, which means that if you roll a 1 and you roll a 20, you get to take the 20. It means that you have also, if you have advantage on attack rolls, you go from having a 5% chance to hit on a crit with 10% chance. Having advantage is always good, and you really want to maximize how much advantage you're getting. Barbarians also gain bonus damage to the roll when attacking, whilst raging. It's really powerful and it's got its own table, and I would get into this, but again, I would be here for 3 hours describing this, that, and every other thing that relates to a class. And finally, you have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. These three damage groups generally describe melee weapons. They can also describe things like the claws of a dragon. Some spells also can deal piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning damage, so it really depends on what you're facing whether or not this will come in useful. You gain unarmored defense. We haven't really gotten to equipment, and we won't probably get into it until close to the end of wrapping up a character. But I will say that whilst you're not wearing any armor, your armor class is 10, plus your dexterity and constitution modifier. Remember how I just said that you probably want decent dex and constitution to tank? Well, you probably want decent dexterity and constitution to also take advantage of unarmored defense. I'll be going over every class to 3rd level because that seems like a fairly decent place to start. Most campaigns at Derps often start round about level 3 from what I've seen when it comes to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Now, reckless attack. There's a lot of flavor text here, but all we need to remember is when attacking, before you make your first attack, before you've even rolled a dice for it, you can decide to attack recklessly. You now have advantage on melee weapon attack rolls that use strength during this turn, which means that you get to roll 2 dice instead of 1 when you're attacking. This could mean that you're more likely to crit or land a blow in a slippery enemy. However, any attack rolls against you also have advantage. What this ends up meaning is that when enemies attempt to hit you, they're more likely to hit, and even more likely to land a critical hit on a 20 on the 20-sided die. You gain danger sense. The good thing we've just explained advantage, because here you gain advantage on dexterity saving throws against effects you can see, such as traps and spells. Don't always assume that you can see these things. Ask your DM for clarification. It will probably drive them up the wall to constantly answer the same question, but it's better safe than sorry. And then, at 3rd level, we get our subclass. Every class gets a subclass between levels 1 and 3. I'll go more in depth with what subclasses are when we get to doing the fighter, which I'm going to leave to last. However, please note that these help give you additional abilities and really make each character distinct from each other. There's another set of things called feats that also help with that, but we'll get there when we get there. The Bard is a spellcaster that uses the Charisma stat, but you're going to also want, again, to have decent dexterity and constitution. Constitution and dexterity are incredibly important to every single class. You don't want to get hit, and if you do get hit, you want to survive the hit. I once played a Warlock, which we'll get to in a moment, which had a constitution of 7. which meant that every time I leveled up, I had -2 health than I should have. I had 27 HP at the end of a level 7 campaign and was immediately one-shot during an encounter. If I had higher constitution, I would have survived. Even as a squishy caster, please make sure you have at least 10 constitution, if not higher. Bards have a D8 as a hit die, which means they're a bit more squishy than the barbarian, but they're still tankier than some other classes. Their primary ability is charisma, which is what they make their spells through. Spellcasting will take a while to explain, so I'm going to give you the very brief TLDR of what spellcasting is and what it does. Every class has a limited number of spell slots that you can find by looking at your copy of the Player's Handbook or basic rules at that specific class. You can only cast that many spells at that level, of which there is 1 to 9, per day before you need to take a break. There's an exception to who needs to take a long rest before this, but we'll get into that. You have cantrips and spells. Cantrips are also known as level 0 spells because they can cast an infinite number of times. Cantrips also scale as your character levels up in short ways, but spells are usually more versatile. You're going to be casting spells almost every single encounter, but you have to remember to conserve your resources. Dungeons & Dragons is designed to have between 4 to 6 encounters per day. This means that if you blow them all in the first encounter of a day, you might not have any spells left if you get into another fight, or you need them to, say, help cross a chasm. So always remember to not blow all of your resources. I will also state that you may want to check with your DM how many encounters they'll be running per day before you choose a class and what spells you use and how many you use in a fight. Very important to always make sure to communicate with your DM, because they may be running things differently than you think, they may have different rules than you know. It is good to have this clarification in mind, especially when you're building a character. I happen to know the DM I'm going to be building my fighter for runs very closely to the rules as written, which means that I understand exactly how to build this character for that situation. Clerics. Clerics are very much misunderstood. A lot of people seem to think that clerics have to be very heal orientated, they're going to be your support caster. That's not necessarily true. Clerics make incredible, versatile characters. They choose their subclass at level 1, and they also use Wisdom as their spellcasting ability. You're going to want to have at least some Wisdom, Dexterity, and Constitution. Clerics gain access to something called Channel Divinity, which the effects of which vary depending on which subclass you end up going into. Again, I would love to have the time to go into every single subclass, but I would be here for hours. Channel Divinity Turn Undead means that once you use this ability, every undead within 30 feet of you must make something called a Wisdom saving throw. We've been over Dexterity saving throws. Wisdom saving throws are the exact same thing. You roll a d20 and then you add or subtract your modifier depending on the score. If they fail, the casting DC of which is equal to twice your cleric save DC. Sorry, not twice, just your cleric spell save DC. Which again you can look into when you are making your own cleric, if you choose to do that. And I highly suggest it. Cleric is one of my favourite classes to play just because of how versatile they are. Sure, you can play a support, but they also make excellent damage dealers or just general support characters. This is the last thing we need to look at for the cleric because they get a lot of subclass features. Druids are going to be a bit wordier, even if I am trying to briefly skip over what each class is. First of all, we could ignore this. This is what we call a ribbon feature. Not very important. It makes good for good role-playing. Doesn't really matter mechanically. You can go over this on your own time. They also have spellcasting, which uses Wisdom. Their primary abilities are Wisdom. But again, decent Constitution, decent Dexterity. Druid's main power fantasy is the fact that at second level, you can start transforming into different animals. There's a bit of a limitation on this for those who aren't in a specific subclass, which I dare not mention because I don't believe is mentioned in the basic rules. Please don't assassinate me, Hasbro. We have second level, your max CR is 1-4. CR really only matters to the GM. It's a basic idea of how strong a creature is. In this case, 1/4. This means that, theoretically, per level 1 player, they should be able to handle, total, between each of them, about 1 wolf. If you have a party of 4, and your level is 1, then you really only need to be going up to the max CR of 1. As your party increases in level, you can increase the number of wolves, or you could face them with something more powerful. Regardless, CR isn't something you really need to worry too much about unless you are playing a druid, or unless you are being the DM. And if you're being a DM, you're going to need a bit more than a basic introduction to D&D. I would really suggest picking up the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, you've got a limitation of beast shapes, so no flying or swim speed. This means that when you start out, unfortunately, you can't turn into a cool crocodile or anything else a bit stronger. But you can still turn into a wolf, as listed here. I won't get totally into the different options available to you, but I suggest if you were going to play a druid, get yourself a nice list of creatures you have seen and that you can often turn into. You'll find yourself a lot more comfortable if you can easily say, okay, this is the stat sheet for the thing I want to turn into, rather than having to look it up last second. This is also doubly true if you're playing in person, because whilst I have gotten accommodated to playing online over the course of this horrible pandemic, some people have been playing in person for years, and that means that you need to have the information in front of you. You don't want to be holding up the game whilst you're humming and hawing trying to decide what beast you're going to be. There are additional rules for being transformed that I do need to get into to explain the druid properly and explain why I think druids make excellent frontliners as well as casters. Your game statistics are replaced with the statistics of the beasts, but you retain intelligence, wisdom, and charisma scores. Basically, we can say that you retain all your mental capacity, but your physical capacity can change. This means that you can actually have fairly high scores if something has high strength, dexterity, constitution, but low wisdom, intelligence, and charisma. Because if you have decent charisma, intelligence, and wisdom scores, the beast has decent intelligence, wisdom, and charisma scores. The most important thing to note is if the creature has the same proficiency as you, and the bonus and higher stat block, you use that. So you get to keep your own proficiencies and gain that of the creatures. Incredibly handy. But you are kind of limited because if you don't have thumbs, you're probably not going to be able to do some things. When you transform, you assume the beast's hit points and hit die. What this means is you become a fully HP version of whatever you transform into, and then you can take damage. If you revert as a result to dropping to 0 hit points, any excess damage carries over to your normal form. So if you have 10 HP, or in this case, if you have 1 hit point as an animal and you take 10 damage, you turn back into yourself and take 9. But think of it this way. If you have 10 HP as an animal, and you take, say, 9 points of damage, that's 10 points that aren't going to your main hit dice. You can also transform multiple times in a single combat encounter if it requires, so don't feel too bad about using your wild shape if the situation seems to demand it. You can't cast spells and you can't speak as an animal, unless you're a specific subclass. But it also doesn't break concentration on any spells you cast, or prevent you from taking actions that are part of the spell. So you could say, cast a spell that requires concentration, which requires you to... Concentration rules are actually very complicated. I'd probably leave that out. Basically know that if you have anything that lasts multiple turns and requires your focus on it, you don't drop that focus when you transform. Everything else here is kind of just skimmable, to be honest. So we'll get over that. Monks. Finally, we're on monks. Monks are a master of martial arts, and don't they know it? They have an armored defense, so they're pretty tanky. They get AC plus is 10, plus dex modifier, plus wisdom. You might remember this being almost similar to the barbarians' unarmored defense, except this uses wisdom instead of constitution. You also gain martial arts. You can use your dexterity instead of strength for attacks on your unarmed strikes and monk weapons. You get to roll a d4 in place of normal damage for your unarmed strikes, and it also increases as you gain levels. Oh, sorry. Let me just take a step before I continue reading. Monks are very much versatile. They gain key points which they can use to use things like Flurry of Blows, Patient Defense, and Step of the Wind. You also get more key features as you gain levels in this class. Monks are very much capable of darting around the battlefield, delivering a flurry of blows and backing out. They are very good at taking down targets, and later on, although you won't get this till later on after level 3, which I won't go into, you gain one of the best shutdown abilities in the game in the name of Stunning Strike. You gain unarmored movement. Whilst you're not wearing armor, this is very important to note, or wearing a shield, you gain an additional 10 feet of movement. Your movement speed is based on your your race. Most races have 30 feet of movement. Some, such as Wood Elves, have 35, and some, such as Dwarfs, have 25. So it does matter. If you're playing a monk, you may wish to go for something with a higher movement speed, so you can dart around the battlefield a bit better. At 3rd level, we gain our subclass, but we can scribble that, and we also get the ability to deflect missiles. If an attack is coming from a ranged weapon, you can deflect it, and then the damage is reduced by 1d10 plus your dexterity modifier plus your monk's level. If you reduce the damage to 0, you can catch the missile, and if you spend 1 key point, you can throw it back. You make this attack with proficiency regardless of your weapon proficiency, and it counts as a monk weapon, which is a normal range of 20 feet and a long range of 60 feet. This means that as long as you're within 20 feet of the target, you don't have disadvantage, unless it's within 5 feet. And then the longest you can hit away is 60 feet. You're probably not going to be able to throw an arrow over 120 feet anyway, but it does mean that you can attempt to attack people with the same weapons they're hitting you with. Paladins. Paladins are regarded as some of the strongest classes in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons because they have such versatile abilities. Let's get into some of them, shall we? We'll skim over this because there's a lot of words here that matter very little. You would know the location of any celestial fiend or undead within 60 feet of you. You know the type, you don't know its identity, but you know it's within 60 feet of you. You can also detect the presence of any place or object that has been consecrated or desecrated, as with the Hallow spell. And you can use this equal to 1 plus your charisma modifier, and on a long rest, you regain all expended use. This ability is what we call a ribbon feature. It probably won't come up too much, but who knows, maybe you'll find a mysterious nobleman who seems totally like a vampire, and you just want to make double sure. Lay on Hands is a very versatile ability that can be used to pick people up from the brink of death, or cure some status debuffs such as being affected by poison. You get level times 5 number of Lay on Hands points, which means at level 1 you can heal 5 HP, and at level 2 you can heal 10, level 3 15, you get the point. You can also expend 5 to target and cure 1 disease or neutralize 1 poison. You can cure multiple diseases and neutralize multiple poisons with a single use of this ability, which takes 1 action, which we'll get into when we start describing combat. But you're probably not going to use this very much. You're probably going to use more of the healing. It's still nice to have the ability. We'll get into what fighting styles are when we look at the fighter, because it really impacts them a little bit more. Spellcasting. Paladins use charisma for spellcasting and gain it slightly later than other magic users. This is because they're known as what we call a half caster. But you're probably not going to be casting too many paladin spells because of their second level feature, Divine Smite. When you hit a creature with a melee weapon attack, you can expend 1 spell slot to deal radiant damage to the target in addition to the weapon's damage. The extra damage is 2d8 for a first level spell slot, plus 1d8 for each level spell slot higher than first, so a maximum of 5d8, which means the maximum you can do is an additional 5d8 by giving up a 5th level spell slot. The damage is increased by 1d8 if the target is undead or a fiend, so a maximum of 6d8. So if you wanted to make someone who's really good at killing undead or demons, you go for a paladin. This ability is really good simply because it just adds an absurd amount of damage for a paladin on melee attacks that you're not going to really get from your spell list. At 3rd level, you become immune to disease, and you also gain access to your subclass. Ranger. Rangers have a D10 hit die, which means they're tankier than the Bard we saw earlier. Their primary ability saves are Dexterity and Wisdom. Strength and Dexterity are their saves, but your primary abilities are Dexterity and Wisdom. There's nothing stopping you from making a Strength-based Ranger, just be aware that you'll kind of struggle. Rangers are regarded as having a really iffy set of base ability. This is because a lot of them are very much dependent on the enemy and terrain you are in. If you were going to play a Ranger, and you do not have access to the optional class features added in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, ask your DM what kind of enemies you're likely to be facing, and what kind of terrain you're likely to be traveling through. It's just nice to have the ability to take advantage of some of these features. You get to choose a type of favorite enemies from all of these. I'm not going to list them all. Alternatively, you can select 2 races of humanoids, such as Gnoll and Orc, as favorite enemies. You advantage on survival checks, that's a specific skill, to track your favorite enemies, as well as intelligence checks to recall information about them. When you gain this feature, you can also learn one language of your choice that is spoken by your favorite enemies, if they speak one at all. What this means is if you are tracking, say, Celestials, you'll be able to speak Celestials. If you're trying to track Dragons, you'll be able to speak Draconic, etc., etc. You get to choose an additional favorite enemy as well as an associated language at 6th and 14th level. As you gain levels, your choice should reflect the type of monsters you've encountered on your adventure. This is very much a very flavorful option that doesn't have too much mechanical impact, but it is nice to have. Natural Explorer, a lot of DMs don't run the travel rules as written, so you might struggle to get advantage out of these. However, I'll just very quickly go over what it says. Whilst you're part of a group, difficult terrain doesn't slow you down. Your group cannot be lost except by magical means. If you're getting lost, it will probably be magical means. Even when you're engaged in another activity while traveling, you remain alert to danger, so you won't get surprised or ambushed or anything. If you're traveling alone, you can move stealthily at a normal pace. You're probably not going to see this coming up when it comes to traveling. Simply because if you're traveling in what we call a hex crawl, you're probably dragging your party along with you, because you don't want to separate the party. When you forage, you find twice as much food as you normally would. There are spells that really mitigate the need to find food whilst traveling. This doesn't come up as much. While tracking other creatures, you also learn their exact number, size, and how long ago they passed through the area. That's pretty useful, to be honest. If your DM wants to help you, say, find a group of rampaging orcs, then you'll be able to find them. Rangers use Wisdom as their spellcasting ability. They don't really have all that big a spell list, but they can do some things. Their main thing will be using casting a spell called Hunter's Mark to deal additional damage when they attack things for the first time in a turn. We gain our subclass. I'll go over subclasses when we get to the fighter. Primeval Awareness. I'm finding a way to word this positively. It sucks. Unapologetically. It doesn't mean you shouldn't play a Ranger. I'm just warning you that you will almost never find any value in Primeval Awareness. Let's explain. For 1 minute per spell level you expend, you can choose to give up a spell slot to be able to find things in your area. You can sense the location of a favored, enemy, of any enemy type you choose. Or rather, you can sense it right within 1 mile of you. I want you to think how large a mile is. Right? Internalize that. 1, either you can hear, see, or find them normally without using this ability. Or 2, they are hidden underground by a mile and you're not going to find them on the surface anyway. If you were within favored terrain, which I glossed over because it won't come up very much, but it means stuff like deserts or grasslands or forests or mountains or whatnot, you can see within 6 miles. Now, I want you to think about how large 6 miles is and how limited your perception might be in some of these areas. Somehow, you get worse at discovering the relative location of things because you were comfortable with the terrain. The feature does not reveal the creature's location or their number. You're not really going to be getting much value out of this one. Rogues. We're almost there, folks. We're almost there. Almost at the fighter. You gain something called Expertise, which I mentioned earlier. You get to choose 2 things you're proficient in, and then they are doubled. So at level 1, you might have proficiency in Stealth, Well, now your +2 to stealth bonus becomes a +4. At 6th level, you can choose 2 more proficiency in skills or with thieves tools to gain this benefit. Rogues have something called sneak attack. I won't get too much into this, but it means that if they're attacking a target with advantage, or if that target is adjacent to another hostile creature to that target, you do a bit more damage. The damage goes up as you level. Thieves' Cant is an additional language spoken by thieves. You can also understand set equals and signs. A good TM might find a way to incorporate this, but keep in mind it just might not come up. 2nd level, you gain quick thinking ability to move now quickly. Bonus action, dodge, disengage, or hide. Or, that's it. Sorry, not dodge. Dash, disengage, or hide. Dash, disengage, and ditch. Probably the best way to describe those things. Dashing means that you would sacrifice an action to move double your movement speed. Or, in the case of the rogue, a bonus action, which means that you can also dash and then attack. Disengage means you do not provoke something called Attack of Opportunities, which I'll get into when I'm finally analysing the character's ability of the fighter that I'm going to build. The Hide action lets you hide from enemies and go into stealth. Every class can use this, however, Rogue's capable of doing it on a bonus action. Level 3, we choose a Roguish archetype, or subclass. Here we have the Sorcerer. They have a hit dice of a d6. This means that they're fairly frail and don't want to get into melee combat too much. At 1st level, they get to choose their subclass, their Sorcerer's origin. They use Charisma for casting spells. So again, decent dexterity, decent constitution, and you want your Charisma to be pretty high to be a good spellcaster. You gain something called sorcery points, which don't really matter until 3rd level anyway, but basically you can expend sorcery points to make your spells do cool things, such as making a fireball not hit people. Or alternatively, you can use it to cast spells from further away, you can use it to cast spells silently without making a noise, or you can use it to twin some spells, which means that if you've got a single target spell, you can cast it on 2 people. Rather effective. The Warlock. The Warlock is has a bit of a troubled past. Mostly because some people find it rather bad, some people love the flavor. Personally, I love the flavor, but I will admit, if you are in a campaign that does 1 encounter per day, you are going to struggle with the Warlock. Warlocks get their spell slots back on short rests, and to balance this out, this means that they have a relatively low number of spell slots per caster. In fact, I believe all the way up to like level 11, you're only going to have 2 additional spell slots per day. At 1st level, you get to choose your subclass. This really impacts your gameplay style and even gives you an additional list of spells that you can learn. At least for some subclass options. I will say that the one in the player's handbook, there is the Fiend and the Archfey. The Fiend is probably the better out of the 2. They also have Pact Magic, which is the funny way of saying this is how you cast spells, and it's different than other spell casting because you get it back on a short rest. Eldritch Invocations make Warlocks incredibly customizable. In fact, they're probably the best thing about the class. I won't get into Invocations because I really would be here for about 3 hours, but they are incredibly potent. Pact Boons are almost a subclass on a subclass. There are 3 total pacts within the player's handbook. I believe the only one in the basic rules is the Pact of the Tome. I might be wrong there. I've not looked at that. It doesn't matter. But it gives you so many more options, and it lets you make between the Pact Boons and the Eldritch Invocations and your subclass. Warlocks are incredibly variable charisma-based casters. They also gain one of the best cantrips in the game called Eldritch Blast, which does 1 10-sided dice worth of damage, and it can be augmented by the various invocations to be rather useful. Last but not least, the Wizard. A lot of the wizard's powers come from whichever subclass you choose, so it's going to be a very quick read here. You can cast spells, you use intelligence as your casting modifier, you've got d6 dice. Remember to read your player's handbook. I'm only going over all of these briefly. If you're going to play D&D, the basic rules are available for free from multiple sources. You can figure out how to build a character from there. You can also buy the player's handbook from numerous sources, including Amazon, here on D&D Beyond, or other sources. At first level, you gain Arcane Recovery. You can take a short rest and make spells and gain back expended spell slots equal to a combined level equal to less or equal to or less than half your wizard level rounded up. This isn't really the most useful feature in the world, but it gives you a bit more staying power, considering you're probably the most spell-dependent class on the list. You can only use this once per long rest. At second level, you gain your Arcane Tradition, which is your subclass. This impacts everything. So, again, because I'm not going over subclasses, I'm not going to spend too much time in this, but know that there are 8 in the player's handbook alone. Abjuration, Conjuration, Divination, Enchantment, Evocation, Illusion, Necromancy, or Transmutation. There's so many more different features granted to you that these kind of make the backbone of the wizard class. Now, finally, the fighter, which I intend to go a bit more in depth in, so we're actually just going to add the class straight away. And then we'll go into what's granted. So first of all, you get the proficiencies. These are basically stuff that you can use without penalty. You can use all armor and shields, and this basically means that you can use all weapons. You have no tool proficiencies to start off with, and you have proficiency in strength and constitution saving throws. You can choose 2 skills from acrobatics, animal handling, athletics, history, insight, intimidation, perception, and survival. We'll get onto those in a bit. Right now, I'm just going to pick 2. It doesn't matter what. Now, fighting styles. I mentioned these earlier, and for good reason. Fighting styles are important to the Ranger and the Paladin, but you can also pick them up with the Fighter. Each of these has a different benefit. Let me just double check there is a fighting style section here. Yeah, cool. So we'll pick from one of these. Archery means that you do +2 damage whenever you make an attack. You're more accurate when you make a shot with a bow. Defense means that you have a +1 bonus to your armor class, which makes you harder to hit. Dueling means that whilst you're wielding a single melee weapon in one hand and no other weapons, this means you can use it with a shield, you get a +2 bonus damage roll, so it means you do a bit more damage. Great weapon fighting means that with two-handed swords, when you roll a 1 or a 2 on a damage die for an attack you make with a melee weapon, you get to re-roll 1s or 2s. You do have to take the second roll you make, but with a fighter, it just basically means that you have the benefit of usually rolling a bit higher. The average for a great axe, which is a 1d12 weapon, would obviously be averaging round about 5, 6, or 7 with this, because you get to roll 1 or 2s. Basically, it means you're less likely to roll and stick to 1 or 2s when making an attack. Protection is a very good ability if you're trying to be a tank and redirect attacks towards you. You can impose disadvantage on attack rolls using your reaction, which we will get into. And finally, 2-weapon fighting. When you engage in 2-weapon fighting, you can add your ability modifier to the damage of the second attack. I'll get into 2-weapon fighting when we get to the character section, because it is available to every class, regardless. In this case, though, we're going to take something really simple. Anyone can understand it. We're just going to take defense. Fighters get Second Wind. Basically, you can use your bonus action to regain hit points equal to 1d10 plus your fighter level. It's good for topping you up in the middle of a battle when you don't have anything else to use your bonus action on, but it's not going to be your main source of healing yourself. Now, we're going to leave the leveling up a little bit, so we can go into backgrounds. Now, for Layman, the fighter, he's going to be pretty basic. So Layman, the fighter, is going to be a soldier. What does this mean? Well, you could ignore quite a fair bit of this. There's a bit of flavor text. It does suggest working with your DM to determine which kind of military organization we're part of, and I agree, it would really help you to get your character laced into the campaign your DM is running, because the DMs at Derps are amazing at this. And then we also gain the military rank background feature. This is again mostly for role-playing purposes, but if you run into, say, a garrison of soldiers from the same people you are, and you are, say, higher ranked than they are, they'll defer to you as if you're still a member of their army. It's just a kind of nice feature to have. It won't come up too much, but nice to have access to. We also gain proficiency with athletics, intimidation, which we'll get into. We gain tool proficiencies with vehicles on land, this being things like horse and cart, and we get to choose a gaming set we're good at. Now, this basically means that you can add your proficiency to, say, vehicles with land, or you can add your proficiency bonus when you're gambling. Your DM might find a way to include this. In this case, I'm going to be rolling dice for my skill proficiency, because that's what you're here to do. You play Dungeons & Dragons, you roll dice. Now, as part of building a character, there's suggested characteristics. Feel free to ignore these and make your own, however, I'm going to make a lawful good character here. I'm going to say that he's always polite and respectful, but he's not very bright, so he's going to always face his problems head on. He thinks he should lay his life around in the defense of others, but he also feels that he must do and obey authority. Honestly, we could just random these. And we'll see what kind of character we end up with for the last couple of sections. Now, we've done this, we've done that. What do we still have left to do? Starting equipment. Every background and every class comes with a set of equipment. Alternatively, you can choose to roll for gold. In my case, though, I'm going to go for the equipment option. I think it's really good to have a starting list of equipment that you want to use. I'm not going to explain my choices too much here, because you're going to have to reference your basic rules or player's handbook to figure out what a lot of these do. And again, I have been streaming for an hour by myself, talking for an hour and 10 minutes. So, you know, my voice is kind of tiring out. We're going to choose a martial weapon and a shield for our character. But I think that the martial weapon we pick is going to be... Sure, it's going to be a battle axe. We also get to choose a light crossbow or 2 hand axes. Well, we have pretty high strength, so I'm going to choose the hand axes because hand axes scale off of strength. We also get to choose between an explorer's pack and a dungeoneer's pack. Honestly, I suggest just picking whichever one of these strikes your fancy when you're looking at the player's handbook or basic rules. In this case, I'm going to pick the dungeoneer's pack. Soldiers also get additional starting equipment. A dagger, a broken blade, or a piece of a banner. I'm going to choose the dagger. There's an insect flying around. And a set of bone dice that we start with. We also have a set of common clothes, as well as the chainmail we have, and a pouch containing 10 gold. Now, what's next? We're going to view the character sheet. This is where I get to go a bit more into how all of this impacts things. So, it's a lot to take in when you first look at it, isn't it? You have to think about your strengths, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, and it can be rather overwhelming for a new player to see all of these stats laid out in front of them. But don't worry, it's pretty easy once you get your head around it. First of all, I'm going to take a look at your saving throws. Your class will grant you proficiency in 2 saving throws. From there, you take your modifier, which in my case is +3, plus your proficiency bonus, listed here, and it becomes a +5 to any strength saving throws I have to make. Same with constitution being +3, after 2 becoming a 5. Besides that, they're all impacted pretty basically by your ability score. There's additional senses which take your passive wisdom, intelligence, and investigation. There's a little bit of a formula for working these out. Which I've completely forgotten because I'm drawing a blank. Oh, yes. In this case, it literally is your baseline Yeah, it's your base plus whatever your modifier is for that specific reason. So because I don't have any additional modifiers for perception, investigation, or insight, it's just a flat 10. This means that unless I'm actively looking for traps, I'm more than likely to miss them. Sorry. We have a list here of our proficiencies and languages. So we can speak Common, Dwarvish, we've got Dice Set, Critical Slam, Martial Weapons, Simple Weapon, Heavy Armor, Light Armor, Medium Armor, Shields. Now, this behemoth right here, probably the most intimidating part of a stat sheet for any new player. Look at the modifier. This tells you which one of these is applicable. So if I'm making an acrobatics check, I take my +2 dexterity. Now, I'm also proficient in acrobatics, so we add my proficiency bonus. This means that any roll I make of acrobatics, in which case I roll a 6 plus a 4 becomes a 10. Fairly simple. Oftentimes your DM will tell you when you need to make one of these rolls, so don't worry too much about memorizing these off the bat. Your DM will help to keep you straight if you are a new player. Again, animal handling, so this is calming down domestic animals. Arcana relates to recalling information about the arcane, such as magic. Athletics is for feats of strength, or jumping, or trying to climb a sheer cliff, etc. Deception is lying to people. My character isn't very good at lying. He's very straightforward and simple. So whenever I roll a dice roll here, I'd have to have a -1. Here I rolled a 15, but because I've got a -1 to my charisma, it becomes a 14. Blech. I'm proficient in intimidation, which means despite the fact that I have a -1 from my charisma, I get a +2 from my proficiency bonus, meaning that any roll I make comes out with a +1. The most important check that I can probably mention here is probably stealth. You're going to be rolling stealth a fair few times, especially if you're playing something like a rogue. This is basically you're not being caught by enemies while sneaking around. It's rather self-explanatory. I'll very quickly go into actions, bonus actions, reactions, and others. You can break up 5th edition combat into action, bonus action, reaction, other. Now, let's explain what these are. Actions, you get 1 of per turn, and you can use it to make an attack. Now, I've not equipped my equipment yet, so why don't I very much equip the equipment I'm going to be using? Notice how that when I equip the chainmail here, my armor goes up to 15 plus my dexterity modifier, but I gain disadvantage on stealth, which means whenever I make a stealth check, I should really be rolling with disadvantage. Which means despite the fact that I got a really high number here of a natural 20, I also rolled a 6. I have to take the lower value. I'm also going to equip... actually, no, we're just going to be very simple. We're going to keep the very basics of what my character would use. I'm using a two-handed battle axe. And also lets me explain what versatile means. Now, versatile weapons can be used in one hand or two hands. If you're using it in one hand, you take 1d8 plus 3. If you're using it in two hands, you take 1d10 plus 3. We get to see the reach, which means I have to be within 5 foot of a target in order to hit them. If I am making an attack roll here, it would be based on my strength modifier plus my proficiency bonus because I am proficient in battle axes. If a 19 hits, I can proceed to roll damages. If I'm using it two-handed here, I roll the 7, which means I roll the 4 plus a 3. If I'm using it one-handed, I roll the 2. There are also various other actions in combat as listed here. Attacking costs an action, casting a spell costs an action, dashing, disengaging, and dodging costs an action. Unless you're a rogue, we mentioned that dash, disengage, and hide are a part of a bonus action once you reach 2nd level. You can grapple, which I'm not getting into because the grapple rules are complex as heck. Ask your DM. Watch them die inside trying to explain it to you. You've got the improvise action, which is basically anything outside of that kind of limited stuff listed here. The ready action, which means that you can define a specific trigger that would cause you to do an action in response, such as, it's listed here, if the cultist steps on trapdoor, I'll pull the lever that opens the trapdoor. You can also shove, which is requiring you to make a athletics check tested by the target making a strength or dexterity check. The target chooses the ability to use, which usually means that they'll use whichever is highest. Now, there's also using an object. Why is that? Because the other category. This is not really listed anywhere, it's not really too obvious, but you get 1 free object interaction per turn. This could be drawing or shooting a sword, opening or closing a door, etc, etc. So technically you can actually only open 1 door per round of combat. Fun facts. Let's look at the disengage action. Earlier I mentioned we'd cover reaction. And this says here that your movement does not provoke attacks of opportunity. What's an opportunity attack? Well, reactions are something that can be used on other people's turns. You gain them back every single time you take a turn. At the start of your turn even. You can make an opportunity attack when a hostile creature that you can see moves out of your reach, which means that as long as it's moving next to you it's fine, but if it leaves your active area of weapon reach, such as say my battle axe of 5 foot, then you can use your reaction to make 1 melee attack against the provoking creature. It's pretty useful to help disincentivize enemies from moving out of your range. Nobody wants to be hit with a battle axe after all, or any other weapon you're wielding. Finally, bonus actions. For the fighter, this includes second wind and attacking with a second weapon. Attacking with a second weapon both must have the light classification. You can find this by consulting your basic rules or your player's handbook. Sorry, taking a moment. You do not add your ability modifier to any attack you make with that second-handed weapon, unless you have the two-handed fighting style. We also have second wind. So we get 1 action, 1 bonus action, 1 reaction, and 1 object interaction. So if I use second wind on a turn, I can't attack with my second weapon in my hand. Now, I said we were going to cover up to level 3, and I've not done that quite yet for the fighter. At second level, we gain Action Surge. You can push yourself beyond normal limits. Basically, you get to take a second action. This is incredibly important for the fighter. At higher levels, such as 5th level, which I'll just prove here, you actually gain the ability to make 2 attacks instead of 1 whenever you take the attack action. This would mean that you can make 4 attacks in a single turn. It also means that you can attack and then Action Surge to take the dodge action. You can only use this once per short or long rest, but it's still incredibly useful. Make sure to take advantage of this whenever you feel like you can. Now, I am only going to be looking at the basic rules subclass, the Champion Fighter. There are other subclasses available, I'll let you take a look, but because I'm only covering stuff within the basic rules, I'm only covering the Champion. I have a natural disdain for the Champion. I don't like it very much, but I will cover it honestly, and I will say that if you are a very first time player, it's not too bad. Now, the Champion Fighter. You gain this at level 3, beginning when you choose this archetype at 3rd level. Your weapon attacks score a critical hit on a 19 or a 20. Normally, you have to roll a 20 to crit, which means that unfortunately, every time you attack, you don't have that high a chance to score a critical hit. But with the improved critical, This means that you can crit on a 19 or a 20. Now, I didn't want to cover multi-classing here, but I'm very quickly going to say that if you are a barbarian of any kind, going into fighter for the improved critical alone is really useful. I'm also going to cover the rest of these features because they're all passive effects, and it's not going to take me too long. Starting at 7th level, you can add half your proficiency bonus rounded up. This is unique, most things round down in Dungeons & Dragons. Do any strength, dexterity, or constitution check that you make that doesn't already use your proficiency bonus. Fighters are already proficient in strength checks, so really this leaves dexterity and constitution. At least for saving throws. For ability checks. But still, it's rather nice to have. Chances are you're probably proficient in most of these anyway, because you want to play to your strength, not your weakness. In addition, when you make a long jump, the distance you can cover increases by a number of feet equal to your strength modifier. Pretty nice. It's just a little bit of flavor, but hey, maybe you can jump that canyon. Additional fighting style. At 10th level, we get to choose another one of those fighting styles we covered earlier. At level 15, we gain a critical hit on a roll of 18, 19, or 20, which means every time you attack, and remember, fighters get multiple attacks, by 15th level, I believe you can attack 3 times a turn before using Second Wind. You get to score a crit 15% of the time. Incredibly useful. Keep in mind, of course, that if you're going to, say, have advantage, this number goes up even more. You'll have a 30% chance to critical hit. And then finally, at 18, you regain hit points equal to 5 plus your constitution modifier if you have no more than half of your hit points left every turn. You don't gain this benefit if you have 0 hit points. So you just really gain passive healing that keeps you topped up. My main complaint about the champion fighter, and chances are if you're a new player, the most you're going to have to worry about is this bit here. You're probably not going to have to worry about anything else, but my main complaint is that all of these effects are passive. It really reduces the variety of things you can do. Keep in mind that at this point, wizards are capable of casting a multitude of spells. Rogues are doing what rogues do best. They have the ability to sneak around the battlefield and do different things. Fighters as a champion really struggle to make themselves feel present outside of just, I would like to attack this turn, or I'm going to shove, or I'm going to dodge. That's not to say fighters are boring. There's really cool fighter subclasses even within the player's handbook. The Battle Master contained within the player's handbook is regarded as one of the strongest fighter subclasses, even after all the additional subclasses that have been created later on. Let's finish off building my character, shall we? We're going to choose the champion. Every time you level up, your hit points increase as well. So I have 31 because by default, you can choose to take the average of your hit dice. In this case, it would be 10. The average of 10 comes out to 5, plus my constitution modifier of 3. This is how we end up with 31. I could have rolled for these, which you are allowed to do. Please read your player's handbook or basic rules. But seriously, I've been streaming for an hour and 25 minutes at this point, just to get this point across. Now, I've explained almost everything about building a character. All the basics I've covered. I've not covered this. What is a feat? Now, if you're not got this on your screen, you'll probably think I'm talking about the things attached to your legs, but no, I'm talking about F-E-A-T-S. There's only one feat in the player's handbook, but I'll cover it anyway. First of all, I'm going to go to the bit that says feats, if it's here. I hope it is. There we go, feats. There's none listed here. Interesting. If I remember correctly, the feat listed within the basic rules is actually Grappler. I want to say it's either Grappler or Tavern Brawler. It is one of the two more basic feats, but I'm going to explain that whilst also showing you about the alternative to the human fighter. Huzzah. Remember how I ragged on it almost at the start of this livestream, good lord? Well, there's an alternative to humans. I don't mean chickens, they're not featherless bipeds, but we can talk about variant humans. This is something that you're going to have to ask your DM's permission for, but if you're playing a human, they're probably going to say yes. The variant human has the ability, at first level, to gain 1 feat of your choice. In exchange, instead of getting +1 to all ability scores, they can only choose 2 ability scores to increase by 1. In this case, I'm going to say Dexterity, Constitution. We also get to choose an additional skill. I'm gonna casually go with Stealth. Why not? Feat. Now, we're gonna look at the Grappler feat, because I do believe that is what's listed as the basic rule, but there are other feats. I have advantage on attack rolls against creatures I'm in the middle of grappling, and I can use my action to try pin the creature grappled by you, and if I succeed, the creature and I are both restrained. If you're trying to hold someone down for the rest of your team to beat the crap out of them, absolutely beautiful. Absolutely wonderful. A wonderful ability to have the advantage of. There's lots of other feats. I don't want to go into too many of them because a lot of them are supposed to be exclusive to the player's handbook. But some of them will give you a +1 bonus to a stat. I am going to break my own rule here and show something from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, I believe this feat's from. So apologies in advance. I'm going to show off the Piercer feat. Just to prove that, yes, I can increase my strength or dexterity by 1. So I'd say I want to increase my dexterity by 1 because that would make it 16. As you can see by looking at the abilities, it's now 15. Oh, sorry. I could have chosen strength there to bump it up to 16, but I didn't because I'm coming to the end of my hour-and-a-half long spiel that I have planned out. So, I have walked you through the very basics of making a character. Remember, this is probably best done with maybe the help of your DM or somebody that you know plays Dungeons & Dragons, and also with the help of the player's handbook or basic rules if you do not have access to the player's handbook. Oh, almost forgot. Dearie me, I could probably cover this. At 4th level, I know I said we're only covering the class feature to 4, but I need to cover up to 3, but I'll cover up to 4 because this will come up. You gain the ability to choose an ability score improvement or a feat. At 4th, 8th, I think it's like 16th and 19th level, but it depends. Fighters get more ability score increases than every other class, followed shortly by the rogue, and then every other class lies behind the rogue. When you choose an ability score improvement, you can choose 2 abilities to increase by 1. In this case, maybe I'll choose my strength and my dexterity in order to boost both to 16, to give a +1 bonus to both. Alternatively, I could choose a feat, and this would let me take any of the feats listed. This is the only way to gain feats as written, but remember, feats are an optional rule. Check with your DM. Also, if you are a DM or a player, remember that you can potentially get additional feats at your DM's whim by doing certain actions. For instance, you might learn the chef's feat by doing a lot of cooking. Regardless, I'm pretty sure I've covered all of the basics for building a Dungeons & Dragons character, and those of you who are already interested in playing Dungeons & Dragons will now be even more interested in playing Dungeons & Dragons. And you've had a little bit of a talk through on how this isn't actually as intimidating as it looks. Anyway, thank you very much. I have been Alba for the Dundee University Role-Playing Society, and I hope to see you in my next game.